Picture a restaurant overlooking Sydney Harbour in the early 1960s. The light is golden. The wine is French. Across the table sits Annette Andre, 22 years old, luminous, an actress whose face would soon become famous on British television. She is beautiful in the particular way that paralyses shy men. Dark eyes, a quick smile, a self-possession that makes the air around her feel slightly rarefied. The man sitting opposite her is not beautiful. He is round-faced and soft-bodied, 15 years her senior, with the anxious eyes of someone who has rehearsed this moment 100 times and knows, with the certainty of long experience, that rehearsal will not save him. He is sweating lightly. His hands, which can conjure laughter from a stadium, are trembling. He asks her to marry him. She does not say no. She does something worse. She pretends she has not heard. She lifts her glass, changes the subject, and lets the moment pass as though it were a draught from an open window, something briefly felt, then gone. He does not ask again. He will never ask anyone again. Years later, after he was dead, she confirmed the story. "He asked me to marry him," she said. "I pretended I hadn't heard." 3 proposals, 3 refusals. The first woman left because he would not commit. The second said no for reasons that have not survived in any public record. The third, Annette, simply turned away, gently, as though kindness and cruelty were the same gesture performed at different speeds. The man returned to England. He went back to his rented flat, his television set, his work. Within a few years, he would become the most watched comedian on the planet, broadcast in over 100 countries, seen by audiences estimated in the hundreds of millions, a face as recognizable in Bangkok as in Birmingham. He earned a fortune. He spent almost none of it. He lived alone. He ate alone. He died alone. His body was not discovered for 2 days. This is the story of Benny Hill. Not the Benny Hill of the sped-up chases and the saucy postcards, though he is here too, honking and leering and tripping over his own feet. This is the story of the man behind the man. Alfred Hawthorne Hill, born in Southampton in 1924, a boy who learned very early that if you made people laugh, they stopped hitting you, and who spent the rest of his life testing that theory until it killed him. How does a man become the most watched comedian on the planet and remain completely alone? How does a performer who can hold 21 million viewers in the palm of his hand fail to hold a single human being in his arms? These are not rhetorical questions. They have answers, but the answers are not simple, and they are not funny, and they do not arrive accompanied by yakety sax. This story begins, as all stories do, before the beginning. He was born on the 21st of January, 1924, in Southampton, the great port city on England's southern coast, still carrying the memory of the Titanic and the quiet grief of a town that had lost too many of its men to the sea. Some early sources give the year as 1925, an error that persisted in newspaper profiles for decades, as though even the facts of his life could not quite settle into a fixed shape. His father, Alfred Hill Sr., ran a surgical appliance shop on the High Street, a small, serious establishment that sold trusses, bandages, and the kind of intimate medical devices that respectable people required, but preferred not to discuss. According to one biography, the shop also supplied contraceptives from beneath the counter, a detail which, if true, lends the family business a faintly comic irony that the son would have appreciated. His father shook his hand on his birthday, not hugged, shook. That was the measure of the man, decent, reticent, and wholly incapable of the casual physical warmth that children absorb the way plants absorb light. His mother, Helen Cave, was warmer but harried, occupied with the daily machinery of a household that included Alfred, his older brother Leonard, and his younger sister Diana. It was not an unhappy home. It was simply a home in which feelings were implied rather than spoken, and in which a small boy who craved attention had to find alternative means of obtaining it. He found them early. At the age of 5 or 6, the precise date is unrecorded, he began performing. Not on a stage, but on the beach at Southampton, where families came on warm afternoons to sit on the shingle and watch the cargo ships slide past on their way to the docks. The boy would stand on the sand and sing popular songs, music hall numbers, whatever he had picked up from the wireless, and passers-by, amused by his full-cheeked earnestness, would toss coins. Pennies, mostly. Occasionally a threepenny bit, which he would clutch as though it were a sovereign. It was not the money, it was the stopping. People stopped. They looked at him. They listened. For a small, plump, unremarkable child in a city full of unremarkable children, this was a kind of miracle. To be seen. To be heard. To make a stranger pause in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and pay attention to you, this was, he would later understand, the first and most potent drug he ever tasted. His mother took him to the cinema. It was here, in the flickering dark of a Southampton picture house, that he first saw Charlie Chaplin. The effect was instantaneous and permanent. The little tramp, small, shabby, perpetually defeated, perpetually resilient, was not merely funny, he was a grammar. He was a way of turning suffering into laughter, powerlessness into grace. The boy in the cinema seat absorbed this grammar the way a musician absorbs a scale, not as information, but as instinct. He began to imitate Chaplin in the schoolyard. He began to imitate everyone. Teachers, relatives, the man who ran the fish shop on the corner, anyone with a distinctive walk or voice became raw material. He discovered that he had a gift, not merely for mimicry, which is common enough, but for the architecture of humor, for understanding why a gesture was funny, not just that it was. He could take a walk and make it absurd. He could take a phrase and turn it inside out until ordinary words produced extraordinary laughter. The schoolyard was not kind to him. He was plump. He was not athletic. He wore glasses briefly before vanity persuaded him to abandon them. The other boys found in his softness an invitation to casual violence. The pushing, the tripping, the inventive daily cruelties that children inflict on those who are different. He learned with the speed of the genuinely desperate that a boy who makes his tormentors laugh is a boy who does not get hit. The comedy was not a vocation. It was a survival mechanism. The laughter was not joy. It was armor. And then there was Jean. We know almost nothing about her. She appears in the story as a name and a single sentence, his own sentence, repeated in interviews across the decades with the consistency of a man reciting a prayer. She was a girl he knew in Southampton when he was young. Perhaps a neighbor, perhaps a schoolmate, perhaps a girl glimpsed on the beach where he sang for coins. What matters is what she said to him. "You make me laugh, sonny boy." 5 words. They were, in a sense, the founding document of his entire career. Not "you're clever" or "you're handsome" or "I like you," but "you make me laugh." The equation was established. Laughter equals attention, attention equals affection, affection equals love. It was a false equation. It would govern his life. Remember what Jean said. Hold on to it. We will need it later, in a restaurant in Sydney, in a flat in Teddington, in a chair where a cup of tea goes cold. He left school at 16. The war was coming. Everyone could feel it. The way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, and the choices available to a working-class boy in Southampton in 1940 were limited and stark. He took a job as a milkman. He took another as a bridge operator. He took whatever was offered, because the thing he actually wanted to do, perform, make people laugh, stand on a stage and feel the extraordinary warmth of an audience's attention, was not, in 1940, a realistic ambition for the son of a surgical appliance salesman. He did not yet know that the coming war would take 3 years of his life and give him a career. The call-up papers arrived in 1941. Alfred Hawthorne Hill, not yet Benny, not yet anyone, reported for duty with the enthusiasm of a man reporting for a dental extraction. He was not a pacifist. He was not a coward. He was simply a boy of 17 who wanted to make people laugh, and the British Army in 1941 had a limited appetite for comedy. There is an anecdote, possibly true, possibly polished by decades of retelling, that on his first day of basic training, a sergeant ordered him to repair a vehicle engine. He stared at the machine with the blank incomprehension of a man confronting a text in a foreign language. "I think the engine's the bit that's on fire, sir," he reportedly said. The sergeant was not amused. The army, Hill quickly concluded, was not his audience. He was assigned to a mechanical unit. He was, by all accounts, a thoroughly mediocre soldier, willing enough, but possessed of a physical clumsiness that made him a liability with machinery and a source of unintentional comedy for his fellow conscripts. It was this very clumsiness, this gap between what was expected of him and what he was able to deliver, that would eventually save him. The military entertainment units were looking for performers. These were troops of soldiers, actors, singers, comedians, musicians, assembled to tour bases and field hospitals, providing the brief, bright relief of laughter to men otherwise engaged in the business of killing and trying not to be killed. Hill auditioned. He was accepted. And from that moment, his war became a different war entirely. He performed everywhere the army sent him. Not in theatres, there were no theatres, but in mess halls and Nissen huts and muddy clearings behind the front lines, to audiences of exhausted, frightened, homesick men who wanted nothing more sophisticated than to forget, for 20 minutes where they were. The comedy was broad. The jokes were blue. The format was simple. A comedian at the front, a line of pretty girls behind him, music, laughter, applause. Hill absorbed it all. He watched how the other performers worked. He studied timing, delivery, the precise calibration of a pause. He learned that an audience of soldiers would laugh hardest at a man who reminded them of themselves, hopeless, hapless, forever failing to get the girl. This was the template, the man who fails, the girl who escapes, the audience that laughs at the failure. He would refine it over the next 25 years into something that hundreds of millions of people would watch every week. But the seed was planted here in 1943 or 44 in a drafty hut somewhere in southern England, in front of men who would shortly be asked to cross the Channel and liberate a continent. The war ended. He was demobilized. He was 21 years old with no qualifications, no connections, and no money, and he wanted to be a comedian. In post-war Britain, a country of rationing, austerity, and the grim mathematics of reconstruction, this was close to delusional. He tried. He tried with the dogged, graceless persistence that would characterize everything he did. He performed in working men's clubs in the north of England, where the audiences were hard, and the beer was warm, and a comedian who failed to produce laughter within 30 seconds was informed of his failure by means of bread rolls, abuse, and on at least one occasion, a hurled glass. He performed in seaside resorts, in church halls, in the back rooms of pubs where the audience consisted of 6 people and a dog. He bombed in Sunderland so badly that, according to his own account, the silence that followed his act was louder than any applause he had ever received. The silence of a hostile audience is not like ordinary silence. It has a texture, a weight. It presses against the performer like water against a diver. Most people encountering that silence would have retreated to the safety of a regular job, the milkman's round, the bridge operator's booth, the surgical appliance shop. Hill did not retreat. He went back to his rented room, sat down, and began to work out what had gone wrong. This is the quality that separates the professional from the amateur. Not talent, which is common, but the willingness to fail publicly and then in private, to dismantle the failure and examine its components. Hill did this with the methodical intensity of an engineer. He kept notebooks. He recorded which jokes worked and which died. He timed his pauses with a watch. He practiced in front of mirrors, on buses, alone in his room at night, performing to an audience of none with the same commitment he would later bring to an audience of millions. He was, at this point, still a milkman. He delivered bottles in the early morning and performed at night, sleeping in the gap between the two, a pattern that left him permanently exhausted and gave his early performances the slightly wild-eyed quality of a man operating on the fumes of ambition and nothing else. There is an image, unverifiable but persistent in the biographical literature, of the young Hill practicing his routines while walking his milk round, performing to cats on garden walls and pigeons on rooftops, refining his timing against the rhythm of bottles clinking in their crates. And then came the Windmill. The Windmill Theater on Great Windmill Street in London's Soho was the most important proving ground in British comedy. Its motto, "We never closed," referred to the fact that it had remained open throughout the Blitz, but it might equally have described its appetite for new talent. The Windmill ran a format called Reviewdville, a continuous program of comedy, song, and dance that ran 6 shows a day, 6 days a week, and that had launched the careers of Harry Secombe, Peter Sellers, Tony Hancock, and Jimmy Edwards. To play the Windmill was to be taken seriously. To fail at the Windmill was to be quietly advised to consider alternative employment. The theatre had one other notable feature. Between the comedy acts, it presented tableaux vivants, living pictures, in which young women posed, motionless, in states of undress. The Lord Chamberlain's office, which censored all theatrical performances in Britain, had decreed that nudity on stage was permissible only if the performers remained completely still. Movement, apparently, was the threshold of indecency. Stillness was art. This arrangement, comedian, then naked women, then comedian, then naked women, produced in the Windmill audience a unique and slightly surreal atmosphere. The comedy acts performed to rows of men who had come primarily to see the tableaux, and who regarded the comedians as an intermission to be endured rather than enjoyed. To make this audience laugh, To be funnier than the naked women who preceded and followed you was, by common consent, the hardest test in British show business. Hill got his chance. According to one account, he was called in to replace a performer who had fallen ill or, in some versions of the story, fallen drunk. He went on stage. He performed. And something happened. Not a triumph. The Windmill did not deal in triumphs, but a crack in the wall. The audience laughed. Not at everything, and not uproariously, but enough. Enough to be invited back. Enough to begin. It was at the Windmill that he met Dory's Deal. She was a dancer, one of the Windmill girls, young and pretty and possessed of the practical good sense that comes from earning a living in an industry that treats prettiness as a commodity with a short shelf life. They began seeing each other. The relationship was, by the accounts that survive, warm and genuine, and almost entirely free of the neurotic complexity that would characterize his later encounters with women. Doris liked him. He liked her. She made him laugh. He made her laugh. For a brief period, months, perhaps a year, the equation worked. And then it didn't. He would not commit. Not to marriage, not to cohabitation, not to any arrangement that required him to share his space, his time, or his solitude with another person on a permanent basis. Doris waited. She waited with the patient, increasingly desperate patience of a woman who can see that the man she loves is standing on the other side of a door that he refuses to open. Months passed. The door stayed shut. "I can't wait forever, Alf." She called him Alf. Not Benny. He had not yet become Benny. She knew the real man, or as much of him as he was willing to show, and what she saw was someone who wanted love in theory but could not bear it in practice. The intimacy terrified him. The vulnerability, the exposure, the prospect of being truly seen by another person, not as a performer, not as a character, but as a flawed, frightened, ordinary man, was more than he could stand. She left. He let her go. It was the first refusal, though in truth he was the one who had refused to take the step that would have kept her, refused to say the words that would have made the door open. The pattern was set. He would spend the rest of his life reaching for women, and then, at the moment when they reached back, pulling away. The pursuit was safe. The catch was terrifying. It was the comedy of his stage act played out in his private life. The man who chases the girl who runs away. Except that in life, the roles were reversed. The women did not run. He did. It was around this time that he changed his name. Alfred Hawthorne Hill became Benny Hill, Benny, in homage to one of his comedy heroes, the American comedian Jack Benny. The choice was revealing. Jack Benny's persona was that of a man perpetually exasperated by a world that refused to cooperate with his desires, a miser, a narcissist, a figure of magnificent, futile self-importance. There was in the adoption of this name an act of self-creation that was also an act of self-erasure. Alfred, shy, plump, frightened of women, the son of a surgical appliance salesman from Southampton, was buried. Benny, confident, funny, a man with a stage name and a future, was born. The burial was permanent. Alfred never came back, but he never entirely went away either. He lingered like a ghost in a house that has been redecorated but not rebuilt. The BBC gave him his first television appearance in 1950. It was a variety show, one of those loose, cheerful programs that the corporation assembled in the early days of the medium, when television was still regarded as radio with pictures, and nobody quite knew what it could do. Hill appeared, performed, and was noticed. Not celebrated, noticed. There is a difference in television between the two, and it is measured in the number of people who remember your name the following morning. He spent the next 5 years building. Club dates, radio spots, the occasional television appearance, the slow, unglamorous accumulation of experience that separates the working comedian from the overnight sensation. He was not an overnight sensation. He was a morning-after sensation, the kind of performer who grows on you gradually, like a stain on a ceiling, until one day you look up and realize he has been there all along. In 1955, the BBC offered him his own program, The Benny Hill Show. His name in the title, in the Radio Times, on the screen. The first time it aired, he watched it alone in his rented flat. The picture was grainy, the sound was thin, and the man on the screen was unmistakably him and unmistakably someone else entirely. Alfred watched Benny and felt, perhaps, the particular vertigo of a man who has built a mask so carefully that he can no longer tell where the mask ends and the face begins. That same year, he gave an interview to the Daily Mirror. He was 31. He was, by the standards of the profession, a success, his own show, a growing audience, his name in print. The journalist asked him about women. "You see so many chocolates," he said, "that you can't decide which one to pick, and while you're choosing, someone comes along and takes the whole box." It was a joke, of course. He delivered it with the practiced timing of a man who had spent years learning when to pause and when to push. But it was also, unmistakably, a confession. He was describing his own paralysis, the inability to choose, to commit, to reach out and take what was offered before the moment passed. In the same interview, he described the woman he hoped to marry. She would be, he said, an ordinary girl from an office, not an actress, not a performer, not someone from the glittering, unstable world in which he worked, but a civilian, someone normal, someone safe. The detail is heartbreaking in its modesty. He did not want glamour. He did not want beauty. He wanted ordinariness, the thing he had never been able to achieve in his own life. He never found her. Or rather, he found several versions of her and could not bring himself to keep any of them. The second woman to refuse him, or rather, the second woman whom he drove to refusal by his inability to act, appeared in the late 1950s or early 60s. Her name has not survived. She was, by the scant accounts, the kind of woman he claimed to desire, ordinary, gentle, unconnected to show business. He proposed. She declined. The details are lost. And then came Annette Andre. Return now to the restaurant in Sydney, the harbour light, the wine glasses, but carry with you this time the weight of everything that came before: Jean's laughter, Dory's departure, the unnamed woman's quiet verdict. Annette Andre is sitting across the table. And the man who has been refused twice is about to be refused a third time. She was, in many ways, the worst possible choice for a man who feared rejection. She was beautiful, confident, independent, everything that attracted him and everything that terrified him. An actress, not a civilian. A woman of the world, not an ordinary girl from an office. He had listed his requirements in a national newspaper and then fallen in love with someone who met none of them. The proposal, the silence, the pretense of not hearing. We know what happened. What we know now, that we did not know at the beginning, is what it cost him, because this was not a single rejection, but the third in a series, and each refusal confirmed what the plump boy from Southampton had always suspected, that he was, at some fundamental level, unlovable. Not unfunny, never unfunny, The world would shortly confirm that he was one of the funniest men alive. But funny is not the same as loved. The laughter of millions is not the same as the whisper of one. He returned to England. Doris was gone. The unnamed woman was gone. Annette was gone. He was alone, and he would remain alone for the rest of his life. It was the first time he had lost everything, but it would not be the last. Among the things he treasured most, or so the story went, was a letter from Charlie Chaplin himself. The greatest comedian of the century, the little tramp whose films had first ignited a boy's imagination in a Southampton picture house, had watched his work and been moved to write. Whether the letter truly existed or had grown in the telling, Hill kept the memory as though it were sacred. The claim appeared in profiles and was never formally denied. Decades later, Chaplin's son Eugene confirmed that his father had indeed been an admirer, lending the legend at least partial substance. "That letter," Hill told a colleague, "meant more to me than any rating." The words carry the particular sadness of a man for whom professional validation had become a substitute for personal love. A letter from Chaplin could be folded and kept in a drawer. It could be taken out and reread on difficult nights. It made no demands. It required no vulnerability. It was, in its way, the perfect relationship, intimate, affirming, and conducted entirely at a distance. 3 women had said no, but before the decade was out, 100 million people would say yes. And that yes, in the end, would prove more destructive than any rejection. The years between 1955 and 1969 were the years of preparation, the slow, painstaking process by which a good comedian became a great one, and a national audience became a global phenomenon. On the BBC, Hill refined his craft with the obsessive attention to detail that would define his working life. He wrote his own material, every sketch, every song, every sight gag. He performed characters, foreign professors, hapless lovers, pompous officials, wide-eyed innocents. He played with words the way a jeweler plays with stones, turning them until they caught the light at unexpected angles. His double entendres became legendary. He delivered them with an innocence so perfectly calibrated that the audience could never decide whether to blush or applaud. The technique was precise. The words were ordinary, the meaning was not, and the performer's face, that broad, familiar face, maintained an expression of such guileless surprise that the joke seemed to arrive from nowhere, as though the English language itself had misbehaved and the comedian was merely an innocent bystander. But the BBC frustrated him. The corporation's bureaucracy, its caution, its institutional reluctance to let a performer control his own work, all of this chafed against a man who had, since the mess halls and Nissen huts, known exactly what he wanted to do and how he wanted to do it. By the late 1960s, he was restless, dissatisfied, convinced that the format could be bigger, bolder, more ambitious than the BBC would allow. In 1969, he moved to Thames Television. It was the decision that changed everything. Thames was an ITV franchise commercial television, funded by advertising, unencumbered by the BBC's cultural obligations and its ingrained nervousness about anything that might offend. Thames offered Hill what the BBC never had: complete creative control. He would write the show. He would direct it in all but name. He would choose the cast, the sets, the music, the camera angles. He would be, for the first time, entirely and solely responsible for every frame that reached the screen. His producer was a man named Dennis Kirkland, practical, warm-hearted, fiercely loyal, who would, over the coming decades, become the closest thing Benny Hill had to a best friend, and in the end, the only person who came looking when the telephone stopped being answered. Hold that thought. We will return to it. The show that emerged was unlike anything else on British television. Each episode was a miniature variety show, a collection of sketches, songs, quickies, visual gags, and elaborately choreographed comedy sequences, all written by Hill, all performed by Hill in multiple roles, all building towards the signature finale, the chase. The chase. It deserves its own paragraph because it became the most recognizable comedy sequence in the history of television. A group of characters, Hill in various disguises, a troop of pretty girls, policemen, vicars, nuns, the occasional dog, would pursue one another across a park or a field in fast motion, accompanied by a piece of music called yakety sax, composed by the American saxophonist Boots Randolph. Once heard, that melody could not be forgotten. It lodged in the brain like a splinter and stayed there permanently. The chases were not improvised. They were choreographed with the precision of a ballet. Every collision, every pratfall, every near-miss planned and rehearsed until the apparent chaos achieved the mathematical exactness of a Swiss watch. Hill had learned this from Chaplin, from Keaton, from the silent film masters whose work he had studied with the devotion of a scholar. Physical comedy is not the absence of thought. It is thought made invisible. The show was a hit. Then it was a phenomenon. Then it became something for which the English language does not quite have a word. A cultural object so widely distributed, so universally recognized, that it ceased to be a program and became a condition. At its peak, the Benny Hill show was watched by an estimated 21 million viewers in Britain alone. It was sold to between 97 and 140 countries, depending on which source you consult. In America, it ran in syndication and became, for a period in the early 1980s, the most popular British export since the Beatles. The numbers are so large that they lose their meaning. It is worth pausing to restore it. 140 countries means that a man who had failed to make a woman stay in the same room was now making entire continents laugh. It means that in Tokyo and in Tel Aviv, in Sao Paulo and in Sydney, in Moscow and in Mumbai, people who shared nothing, not language, not culture, not politics, not religion, shared this. The sight of a stout man in a flat cap being slapped on the head by a small bald man and finding it funny. The comedy was universal because it was primal. It bypassed language entirely. It spoke directly to the part of the brain that has been laughing at people falling over since the first ape slipped on the first banana skin. In the Soviet Union, where Western television was officially forbidden, the Benny Hill show circulated on pirated VHS tapes, copied, recopied, degraded to a grainy blur, passed from hand to hand like samizdat. In a country where humor was political and comedy was surveillance, the sight of a man chasing women through a park at double speed was not merely entertainment. It was a small, absurd, unanswerable act of freedom. Johnny Carson, the most powerful man in American television, sent an invitation, a seat on the most watched sofa in the English-speaking world. Hill declined. He did not explain why. Perhaps there was no explanation beyond the simplest one. He had spent his life learning how to make people laugh and had never learned how to make them listen. The chat show format required conversation, spontaneity, the revelation of self. The Benny Hill show required none of these. On his own program, he was in total control, every word scripted, every gesture rehearsed, every moment calibrated. On someone else's sofa, he would be exposed. And exposure was the one thing he could not bear. He was not tyrannical on set. By all accounts, he was courteous and soft-spoken, unfailingly polite to crew members. But his vision was so complete that there was nothing left for anyone else to decide. He arrived at rehearsals with every camera movement mapped in his head. He knew where the boom should be, where the lights should fall, where the actor's left foot should land on the third beat of the fourth bar of music. The show was not a collaboration. It was a dictatorship conducted with impeccable manners. And then, one Saturday evening in 1987, he switched on the television. What he heard next would end everything. The program was called Saturday Live. It aired on Channel 4, the network that had been created in part to challenge the comfortable assumptions of mainstream British television. The comedian who took the microphone that evening was a thin, intense, fast-talking man of 28 named Ben Elton. He wore a shiny suit. He paced the stage as though the floor were electrified. His material was political, angry, delivered at a velocity that left audiences either exhilarated or exhausted. And he was, in the late 1980s, the voice of a generation that had grown up under Thatcher and was furious about almost everything. On this particular evening, Elton turned his attention to the Benny Hill show. The words were precise and devastating. "Women can't walk through a park," he told the studio audience, "because of shows like Benny Hill's." The accusation was specific, that the program's repeated depiction of women being chased by men, however slapstick, however exaggerated, however obviously absurd, normalized harassment, that the laughter was not innocent, that the chases were not harmless, that the jolly, round-faced man in the beret was, whether he intended it or not, teaching a generation of men that pursuing women was funny and that women's discomfort was entertainment. The statement was incendiary. It was also, by the standards of the time, persuasive. Britain in the late 80s was undergoing one of its periodic convulsions of cultural self-examination. The comedy that had entertained the previous generation, Benny Hill, Bernard Manning, Jim Davidson, was being weighed on new scales and found wanting. The new comedy was alternative, confrontational, and explicitly political. It did not chase girls through parks. It interrogated the culture that thought chasing girls through parks was acceptable. Hill watched. He did not respond publicly. He never responded publicly. But he said something privately that deserves to be recorded. "I'm not laughing at the girls. The audience laughs at the fool chasing them, and the fool is me." It was a defense, and it was, as far as it went, accurate. The comedy of the Benny Hill show was, structurally, the comedy of failure. The man pursued. The woman escaped. The man was humiliated. The woman was triumphant. If you watched the sketches with the sound off and a stopwatch, you would find that Hill's characters were slapped, tripped, drenched, and rejected far more often than they succeeded at anything. The fool was always the man. The power was always with the woman. But the camera did not always share his interpretation. It lingered on bodies in a way that his words did not. What viewers saw was not always what he intended, and the gap between the creator's vision and the audience's experience is a gap that every artist must, eventually, confront. None of this mattered to the ratings. The audience did not leave. 21 million viewers did not suddenly discover that they had been watching something offensive. The numbers held. The laughter continued. The show, by every measurable standard, remained one of the most popular programs on British television. He was not cancelled from below. He was cancelled from above. Before we reach the dismissal, there is something that must be addressed: the women who appeared alongside him and the accusations that shadowed the final years of the show. The Hills Angels were a rotating troupe of young dancers and actresses who appeared in sketches, performed in musical numbers, and participated in the chase sequences that closed every episode. They were, depending on your perspective, either willing performers in a harmless comedy tradition or exploited props in a format that valued their bodies above their talents. The truth, as is usually the case, was more complicated than either position allowed. One incident became public. During a rehearsal in the early 1980s, a performer named Nikki Critcher alleged that Hill had touched her inappropriately. She slapped him across the face. The rehearsal stopped. Critcher left the studio. Hill, by the accounts of those present, stood in silence for several seconds, his cheek reddening, his expression unreadable, not defiant, not apologetic, but something closer to confusion, as though a rule he had never been told about had been suddenly and violently enforced. Another woman, Stephanie Martin, made a more serious allegation in 1985. He denied it. "It was not the way she describes it," he said. "The matter never reached a court." There were also persistent rumors about his sexuality, whispers that his obvious discomfort with women was not shyness, but something else entirely. He denied these too, with a weariness that suggested he had answered the question too many times. The rumors said more about the assumptions of the era than about the man. The idea that a heterosexual male could genuinely prefer his own company to a woman's was, for many, simply incomprehensible. What is certain is this: no criminal charge was ever brought. No lawsuit was ever filed. The women who worked with him most closely, the angels themselves, would, after his death, speak of him with a warmth and loyalty that complicates any simple narrative of exploitation. "He was kind," one said. "He was gentle." They lied about him. Whether this loyalty reflected genuine affection or the complicated dynamics of a workplace in which power was unevenly distributed is a question that resists a clean answer. And yet, for all the millions who watched him, the life behind the screen was almost perversely austere. He lived in a rented flat near the Thames Television studios in Teddington, a small, modest, determinedly unglamorous set of rooms that he could have replaced 100 times over with the money he earned and chose not to. He did not own a car. "Why would I need a car?" he said once. "I've got legs." He did not own property. He did not own, in any meaningful sense, anything at all. His possessions could have fitted in the back of a taxi, and there would have been room left over for luggage. Dennis Kirkland, his producer and closest companion, would sometimes try to coax him into eating. "Ben, you need to eat something." "I had a sandwich." "When?" A pause. "Tuesday." It was Wednesday. The exchange was comic and appalling in equal measure, a sketch from his own show, except that nobody was filming and nobody was laughing. He subsisted on cheap supermarket meals, tinned food, whatever required the least effort and expenditure. He wore the same clothes until they wore out, then bought identical replacements. He mended his own shirts. He walked everywhere, rain or shine, a stout man in a flat cap moving through the streets of Teddington like a pensioner on a fixed income, rather than a millionaire whose face was recognized from Reykjavik to Rio. He was extraordinarily wealthy. Estimates of his fortune range from 7 to 10 million pounds, and he lived as though he were destitute. This was not eccentricity, it was pathology. The boy from Southampton, the son of the surgical appliance salesman, had internalized a terror of poverty so deep that no amount of evidence could dislodge it. He believed, against all proof, that he was poor, or rather, that he was about to become poor, that the money would vanish, that the show would be cancelled, that the audience would leave, and that he would be returned to the condition from which he had started. A plump, unremarkable boy on a beach, singing for pennies that nobody threw. He travelled sometimes to Marseille. Alone, always alone, staying in cheap hotels, walking the old port, sitting in cafes, speaking French. He was fluent, and also passable in German, Dutch, and Italian, a fact that surprised everyone who knew him only as the man in the beret. In France, he was not Benny Hill. He was Monsieur Alfred, a quiet, middle-aged Englishman who drank coffee and watched the boats and spoke to women in the local market with a courtesy and ease that he could never, under any circumstances, achieve in English. The language freed him. In French he was someone else, or perhaps he was, for the only time in his life, himself. And then there was Christmas. Picture this, a flat in Teddington, mid-1970s. The television is on. The Benny Hill show is airing, a Christmas special perhaps, or a repeat. On the screen, the man in the beret is surrounded by beautiful women, tinsel, laughter, music, an audience of millions. In the flat, the same man sits alone. The remains of a supermarket-ready meal are on the table beside him. There is no tree. There are no cards. There is no one to telephone and no one who will telephone him. He watches himself on the screen. The man on the screen is adored. The man in the chair is alone. The distance between the two, between the performer and the person, between the mask and the face, is approximately 4 feet, which is the distance between the chair and the television set, and it is also infinite. He switches off the television. He goes to bed. Tomorrow he will write another sketch. The day after that, another. The work does not refuse him. The work does not pretend not to hear. Now, the dismissal. In 1989, Thames Television cancelled the Benny Hill show. The decision was made not because the audience had left, the audience had not left, but because the cultural climate had changed, and the executives had decided that the show was no longer compatible with the image the network wished to project. The phrasing, as reported, was blunt. It's no longer funny, it's an old man chasing half-naked women. Old man. The words would have cut deeper than any critic's essay. He was 65. He had been making television for 34 years. He had delivered ratings that most program makers would have mortgaged their souls to achieve. And he was being told, not that he was unsuccessful, but that he was embarrassing. The accounts of how the news was delivered differ. In one version, he was told personally by the head of Light Entertainment. In another, his agent received a telephone call and passed the message along, a method of dismissal so impersonal that it carried its own particular cruelty. In either case, the result was the same. The show was over. The studio was dark. The chase had ended, and this time it was the comedian who had been caught. The offers came. They came from America, where the show was still enormously popular, where the syndication deals were worth millions, where producers were queuing up to give him a primetime slot that would have made him richer and more famous than he already was. He said no. They came from France, where he was beloved, where his command of the language would have allowed him to work in a way that few British comedians could even contemplate. He said no. They came from producers, agents, networks, channels, streaming services that did not yet exist but whose predecessors could already sense the value of a globally recognized brand. He said no to all of them, every offer, every opportunity, every outstretched hand. Why? Because he was waiting for Thames to call him back. He waited the way Dory's deal had waited outside the Windmill Theater 40 years earlier, patiently, faithfully, with a hope that diminished by the day but never quite disappeared. He believed, with the irrational, unshakable faith of a man who has confused loyalty with love, that Thames would realize its mistake, that someone would pick up the telephone and say, "We were wrong, Ben, come back." That the studio would be lit again, the cameras would roll, the girls would line up for the chase, and the saxophone would play, and everything would be as it had been. Thames did not call. Nobody called. The telephone sat in the flat in Teddington like a small plastic monument to everything he had lost, and he sat beside it, waiting, the way he had spent his entire life waiting, for Jean to say something more than "you make me laugh," for Doris to wait just a little longer, for Annette to hear what he had said. He continued to write. Every morning he sat down at his desk, the same desk, in the same sparse quarters, in the same chair, and wrote sketches in exercise books. Neat, careful handwriting, stage directions in the margins, camera angles noted. Dialogue polished, revised, polished again. He wrote material for a show that no longer existed, for an audience that had been dispersed, for cameras that would never roll. He wrote the way a composer scores music that no orchestra will play, not because he believed it would be performed, but because the act of creation was the only act that had never betrayed him. Nobody would ever read those exercise books. Nobody would ever perform those sketches. But every morning he sat down, picked up his pen and wrote, because the work had never refused him. The work had never looked away. The work had never pretended not to hear. In February of 1992, a doctor told Benny Hill that he needed coronary bypass surgery. His arteries were compromised. His heart, enlarged and overworked, was failing. Without the operation, the doctor said, he might not survive the year. Hill looked at the doctor the way he had once looked at a sergeant who ordered him to fix an engine, with the blank, resigned expression of a man who has understood the situation perfectly and has no intention of complying. "Then I won't survive the year." 6 words. He said them quietly. He did not argue. He did not ask for a second opinion. He did not weigh the options, consult his family. He had no family, not in any functional sense, or agonize over the decision. He simply declined. The operation would have required hospitalization, recovery, dependence on others, vulnerability. It would have required him to lie in a bed and allow strangers to care for him. This was, for a man who had spent his entire life avoiding precisely this kind of exposure, a worse prospect than death. He was also offered dialysis for his failing kidneys. He refused that too. The logic, if logic is the right word, was consistent. Every medical intervention meant surrender, of control, of privacy, of the carefully maintained illusion that he needed nothing and nobody. The boy who had learned to make people laugh so they would stop hitting him had grown into a man who would rather die than ask for help. The armor that had protected him in the schoolyard was now killing him, and he could not take it off. He had worn it so long that it had fused with the skin beneath. He went home. He sat in his chair. He continued to write sketches in his exercise books, sketches for a show that no longer existed, performed by characters that no one would ever see. He drank tea. He watched television. He waited, though it was no longer clear, even to him, what he was waiting for. The telephone did not ring. Thames did not call. The flat in Teddington was quiet. He died on or around the 18th of April, 1992, a Saturday. The precise time is unknown because there was nobody there to record it. The coronary thrombosis would have been sudden, a clot sealing an artery that was already half closed. There may have been a moment of pain, a tightening in the chest, a shortness of breath. Or there may have been nothing at all, simply a cessation, like a television switching off mid-program. One moment the picture is there, the next static, then darkness. He died in the chair. The tea went cold beside him. 2 days passed, 48 hours. The face that had been on every screen on earth went unseen for 48 hours. No one knocked on the door. No one telephoned. No one in the entire city of London, in the entire country that had once watched him every week, noticed that Benny Hill, Alfred Hawthorne Hill, was no longer alive. It was Dennis Kirkland who raised the alarm. Kirkland, the producer, the only man who might reasonably be called a friend, had been trying to reach him by telephone. The calls went unanswered. This was not in itself unusual. Hill had always been erratic about answering the phone, treating it as an intrusion rather than a convenience. But the silence accumulated. It thickened. It became, after a day and then two, the verbal equivalent of knocking on a door and hearing someone move inside but not open it, except that now there was no movement at all. Kirkland contacted the police. They broke down the door. They found him in the chair in front of the television, dressed in the clothes he had been wearing 2 days earlier. The flat was cold. The tea was still in the cup. There was food in the kitchen, cheap, practical, barely touched. The exercise books were on the desk, the last sketch unfinished, the pen capped and placed neatly beside the page. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, of something heavy and still and wrong. The world was informed. The reaction was strange and revealing. The tabloids mourned him without reservation. "Goodbye, Benny," said the Sun. "The funniest man in the world." The broadsheets were more cautious, praising his craft while maintaining a careful distance from his content, as though admiring the engineering of a building whose architecture they found distasteful. One voice was conspicuous by its absence. Ben Elton, the man who had, 5 years earlier, pronounced the verdict that ended a career, said nothing. No public statement. No tribute. No acknowledgement that the man he had attacked was now beyond all attack. The silence was noted by those who remembered his previous eloquence on the subject. The Hills Angels, the women whose presence on the show had been the source of so much controversy, spoke publicly and with unexpected force. "He was kind," one said. "He was gentle. They lied about him." Others echoed the sentiment. The women who had been, according to the prevailing narrative, exploited by the show turned out to be among its fiercest defenders. This proved nothing, of course. Loyalty is not the same as justice, and affection does not preclude harm. But it complicated the story in ways that those who had told it most confidently were reluctant to acknowledge. Letters arrived at the television studios, at the newspapers, at addresses that no longer connected to anything. thousands of them. From Japan, from Brazil, from Germany, from India. People who had never met Benny Hill and never would, writing to say that he had made them laugh, that his show had brightened difficult evenings, that they were sorry he was gone. The letters were, in their way, the answer to a question he had spent his entire life asking. Did the laughter mean anything? Did it count? Was it, in some sense, love? It was. But it arrived too late, and it was addressed to the wrong man. They mourned Benny. Nobody mourned Alfred. His estate, somewhere between £7 and £10 million, passed to distant relatives, nephews and nieces whom he had rarely seen and barely knew. There was no will, or none that reflected his final years. Dennis Kirkland received nothing. No woman was named. No friend was acknowledged. He had denied himself every comfort that money could buy, and in the end the money went to strangers who shared his surname but not his solitude. He was buried at Hollowbrook Cemetery in Southampton, the city where he had been born, the city where he had sung for pennies on the beach, the city he had left at 17 and to which he was now returned, feet first, in a box. The funeral was small. The mourners were few. The grave was marked with a simple stone. And then, in October of 1992, barely 6 months after the burial, the grave was desecrated. Vandals, or souvenir hunters, or whatever name you choose for people who dig at a dead man's resting place. The stone was damaged. The earth was disturbed. Even his grave was violated. The family's response was extraordinary. They had the grave covered with a thick slab of concrete, not a headstone, not a memorial, but a barrier, a fortification. The message was unmistakable: leave him alone. He wanted to be left alone in life, and now, in death, the wish would be enforced with poured concrete and steel reinforcement. Not a memorial, but a fortification. Not a tribute, but a barricade. The concrete remains to this day. If you visit Hollowbrook Cemetery, and few do, you will find it. A flat, grey, utilitarian slab, flush with the ground, bearing his name and his dates and nothing else. No epitaph, no quotation, no saxophone, no laughter. Just concrete, and beneath it, the man who made the world laugh and could not, in the end, make a single person stay. But there were things the concrete could not contain. The first thing that happened after his death was silence. British television, which had spent the previous 5 years distancing itself from his work, completed the separation with bureaucratic efficiency. Repeats were pulled. Archive footage was locked away. His name, which had once been printed in the Radio Times in letters large enough to read from across the room, disappeared from schedules entirely. For the best part of a decade, the Benny Hill show existed only in the memories of those who had watched it, and in the dusty stockrooms of video shops where unsold VHS tapes gathered a thin film of irrelevance. Then came the internet. Then came YouTube. And then, with the quiet inevitability of water finding its way through concrete, the clips began to resurface. Old episodes, grainy, unauthorized, often sourced from deteriorating tapes, appeared online. A new generation, unburdened by the ideological battles of the 1980s, watched them and did the simplest thing in the world. They laughed. They did not analyze. They did not contextualize. They did not consult the critical consensus. They saw a man in a flat cap being slapped on the head by a small, bald man, and they laughed because it was funny, and because funny does not require permission. DVDs followed, box sets, compilation specials. Suddenly the chase sequences were everywhere, slowed down, sped up, set to different music, turned into reaction videos. used as soundtracks for football fails and cat compilations. Yakety Sax, once dismissed as the signature tune of a disgraced comedian, became one of the most recognizable melodies on the planet. A meme, a ringtone, a tick-tock sound, a shorthand for comic chaos that transcended its origins entirely. By the late 2000s, respectable publications began to reassess his work. Some quietly called him a comic genius who had simply fallen out of fashion. The word genius, so carefully avoided in the years after his death, began to reappear in print, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. The man who had been cancelled from above was being rehabilitated from below, and then the pendulum swung again. The 2010s brought Me Too and a fresh reckoning with the past. In 2017, the singer Hazel O'Connor spoke publicly about an uncomfortable encounter in the mid-1970s. The story resurfaced old questions. It arrived in a cultural moment, the aftermath of the Weinstein revelations, the broader interrogation of male behavior in the entertainment industry that made it impossible to dismiss and difficult to adjudicate. He had been dead for 25 years. He could not confirm, deny, or defend. The accusation hung in the air the way accusations against the dead always do, unanswerable, unresolvable, permanently suspended between belief and doubt. The debate flared and settled into the familiar pattern. Some channels removed clips, others left them. The audience, as ever, mostly kept watching. In the 2020s, the argument moved from screens to streets. In Southampton, a long-running campaign for a statue gained new momentum on the centenary of his birth. The sculptor Graham Ibbesen had created a fiberglass mold back in 2004. It had sat in storage for 20 years. Renewed calls went out. Celebrities added their names. The city council expressed support in principle. Whether the figure ever finds a permanent home remains, at the time of telling, undecided. But the very fact that the conversation continues, that a city is still arguing, 30 years after a man's death, about whether to honor him, says something about how memory works and how guilt and gratitude can occupy the same space without cancelling each other out. Even Ben Elton, years later, offered a careful qualification. "I know everyone thinks I killed him off," he said, "but television just thought it was over for him." Not quite an apology, not quite a defense. Something in between, the careful repositioning of a man who had once been very certain and was now, perhaps, slightly less so. The influence, meanwhile, had long since outgrown the debates. Rowan Atkinson's Mr. Bean carried echoes of the same silent film energy and physical absurdity. In Japan, the program remains cult viewing. In India and across Latin America, it still airs on local channels, to audiences who have never heard of the controversies that once shook British television. The format, sketch, chase, slapstick, the universal comedy of the body, has been borrowed, consciously or not, by shows across the world. 32 years after his death, this is where the story stands. Not resolved, not settled, not tied up with a ribbon and a moral. The laughter continues. The arguments continue. The concrete on the grave holds firm. And somewhere on a phone screen, a teenager presses play on a clip he has never seen before, and the saxophone begins, and the man in the flat cap starts to run, and the boy laughs, the helpless, shoulder-shaking laugh of someone encountering pure silliness for the first time. And for a moment, just a moment, Benny Hill is alive again. A teenager sits in a bedroom somewhere in Britain. Headphones on, phone in hand, scrolling through the endless river of YouTube. The algorithm, that invisible curator of modern memory, serves up an old clip, a man in a flat cap and a raincoat, chasing half a dozen girls in miniskirts across a park. The camera speeds up. The saxophone kicks in that bright, unstoppable yakety sax. The boy bursts out laughing. The helpless, shoulder-shaking kind of laugh that makes him pause the video just to catch his breath. He shows it to his mate. "Look at this. Proper funny." The mate wrinkles his nose. "That's sexism, mate. You can't watch that now." The first boy shrugs. "It's a laugh, though, innit?" They argue for 30 seconds, then scroll on. Neither knows the man on the screen has been dead for more than 30 years. Neither cares about the debates that once raged around his name. They are arguing about format, about tone, about what is acceptable, not about the person who once filled living rooms from Tokyo to Buenos Aires with exactly the same helpless laughter. And so the cycle begins again. It has been turning since 1992. Perhaps it will never stop. There is one question worth asking only once, and asking quietly. When we cancel a man who is already dead, whom exactly are we punishing? He feels nothing. The audience that once laughed is told the laughter itself was suspect. Society does not become kinder. It simply becomes quieter. We do not make the world fairer by removing the things that once made it lighter. This is not an argument for silence. It is not a defense of everything he did or everything that was done in his name. It is simply an observation, offered without heat, without agenda, that the distance between a man and his mask is sometimes so great that punishing one leaves the other untouched. Benny Hill can be debated endlessly. Alfred Hawthorne Hill is beyond all debate. He is in the ground, under concrete, in a cemetery in Southampton, and he does not care what you think of him. He never much cared when he was alive, either, not about critics, not about cultural theorists, not about anyone whose opinion could not be measured in laughter. Look at the other comedians whose lives followed similar arcs. Charlie Chaplin was driven from America by politics and scandal. Buster Keaton slid into alcoholism and poverty before a late, incomplete rehabilitation. Tony Hancock, brilliant, tortured, unable to believe he was as good as everyone told him, took his own life in a Sydney hotel room in 1968. Robin Williams, the most gifted improviser of his generation, did the same in 2014. The pattern is cruelly consistent. The profession that demands you give joy to strangers can quietly drain the last drop of it from the giver himself. And the man at the center of our story, he was never the sad clown of cliché. He was something quieter and more ordinary than that. An introvert who had built an extrovert's mask, so convincing that millions mistook it for the man. He feared closeness the way others fear heights, not irrationally, but from experience, from the accumulated evidence of a lifetime in which every attempt at intimacy had ended in silence, departure, or the gentle pretense of not having heard. He chose women who could never say yes. Then he froze when the moment arrived. He hoarded money not from greed, but from a deep childhood conviction that security could be measured in pounds and pence. He looked in the mirror and still saw the plump, mocked boy from Southampton, ugly, poor, unworthy, even when every screen on earth said otherwise. Laughter was the only currency he ever trusted. It bought him the attention of millions. It never bought him the love of one. One question remains, the very one we began with. The story ends where it started, in the restaurant overlooking Sydney Harbour. Annette Andre, years after his death, finally spoke the words she had kept private while he lived. "He asked me to marry him," she said. "I pretended I hadn't heard." Not cruelty, tenderness. The gentlest possible refusal, offered to a man for whom refusal had become the only language women ever seemed to speak. She could not say yes. She did not love him in that way, and she knew, with the clarity of a woman who understood men better than this particular man understood himself, that marriage would not have saved him. Nothing would have saved him. The loneliness was not a circumstance. It was a condition built into the foundations, like damp in an old house, invisible until you pressed your hand to the wall and felt the cold. Picture the flat in Teddington one last time. The chair is gone now. The teacup has been cleared. The building across the road that once housed Thames Television has been redeveloped. New offices, new windows, new lives. On the pavement outside, someone walks past whistling. That same bright, unstoppable saxophone tune. He does not know where it comes from. It is simply in his head, lodged there like a splinter that never quite works its way out. And far away on the beach at Southampton, the wind still moves the sand in little eddies. Here once, a small boy with a full round face stood singing for pennies. Passers-by tossed coins, not because he was talented, because he was funny. He thought that would be enough. That if he could only make people laugh, someone would stop. Not throw money, just stop. He was wrong, but he never stopped singing. He is gone now. Alfred Hawthorne Hill, born the 21st of January 1924, died on or around the 18th of April 1992. Benny to the world, Alf to the woman who left him, Monsieur Alfred to the cafe owners in Marseille, Sonny Boy to a girl named Jean, whose 5 words set the whole thing in motion. Yet every time you hear yakety sax and find yourself smiling, somewhere inside that smile stands the little boy on the beach, still waiting for someone, anyone, to stop.